You're listening to the Political Risk Podcast, an independent podcast focused on geopolitical risk to serve decision makers in specialty insurance markets, reinsurance, and beyond. I'm your host, David Benyon. Welcome to this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Mosaic Insurance. Our topic is aligning incentives for cybersecurity between insurance, risk management at the client level, and the role of governments and regulators. The context is a volatile cyber risk environment, driven by the challenging geopolitical landscape and a rise in ransomware attacks in particular. My guests for this episode are Yosha DeLong, Global Head of Cyber at Mosaic Insurance, as well as Jason Nurse, Reader in Cybersecurity at the University of Kent. Yosha and Jason, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very glad to be here.
Yosha, please would you just give us an introduction to your own career journey in cyber insurance?
I started dabbling in cyber insurance in 2003 when some of the privacy regulations started coming into effect in California specifically. And we really saw a need for our clients to have a response to what was going on in the requirements around privacy violations. So it started out as very much a privacy-driven product. And there were products in the late 90s that existed and, just really refining them and creating something that our clients could actually use and that they also could understand, because the products were a little complex for your standard company. They were initially really targeted towards technology companies. So that was my first foray into the cyber insurance world. In 2014-15, we saw some major attacks, specifically in the US. We had Home Depot, Primera, Target, and those really raised awareness, I would say globally, about the need for this type of insurance and the fact that this insurance actually even existed, which I don't think a lot of people were aware of before that. It's a huge evolution in the coverage following those events, leading us up to 2018-19, when we started to see the emergence of ransomware. And that has been kind of the topic du jour over the past couple of years. And we continue to see huge impacts from the ransomware side of things as well. So it's been an interesting 20-something years to see the evolution of not only the product, but also the threat and the responses from companies to these threats. Now, I would say, cyber attacks, the threat of cyber exists in almost every aspect of the globe and every aspect of every company, and is something that is impacting economies, impacting governments, impacting political events that are going on all over the world. So this is one of the biggest topics right now in my mind. And I know I live it and breathe it every day, so it is at the forefront, but it's pretty important on a global basis right now.
So our focus today is really on ransomware. And it's fair to say we're talking mostly about criminality, organized crime groups. But is it also fair to say there's a fairly constant geopolitical element to this, whether we're talking about straight out state-sponsored cyber, political actors, or just permissive jurisdictions where a lot of these organized crime attackers base themselves?
Yeah, and just the impacts that we're seeing of these global events, these actual physical wars on the rise or decrease of ransomware. Ukraine, Russia is a great example of once that conflict started, we saw a huge decrease in ransomware because the gangs that existed in those regions were either fractured and they were choosing sides, or they were recruited into the military. So, you do see this impact and you start to see activity of state-sponsored around these geopolitical actual war events that are going on. Israel's another one right now, Taiwan. I mean, anytime you're starting to see some geopolitical government actions or actual boots on the ground war, there's always an element of cyber, good or bad, behind that in this day and age.
So Jason, having read some of your work published online, particularly papers published by RUSI, the defence think tank, and also for the UK government's National Cyber Security Centre, is it fair to say your focus is on the more behavioural aspects of incentivising cybersecurity?
I like to pride myself on the fact that I'm not a pure technologist. I love to actually interact with humans. I love the idea of psychology and intermixing psychology with computer science, psychology with cybersecurity. And that's sort of where I play the most and what I actually enjoy quite a bit. Interestingly enough, my entrance into cyber insurance was only in 2013 when actually a lot of these attacks on Target and so on started to emerge. And that's where I started to be very much interested in cyber insurance. But a lot of my background has actually really explored human aspects of security as it relates to how do we incentivize better security behavior, not only in individuals, but also in companies. How do we get companies to care about security as a key thing for their organization? How do we get companies to think about cyber resilience? And then on the back of that, of course, individuals as well. And how do we get individuals to not click on links, to not send files or emails to the wrong people, to protect their devices? So that's sort of my entry into this area of incentivizing cybersecurity, both from organizational and from a kind of people perspective. Probably one thing I'll flag quite early is, especially as it relates to incentivizing security, this is actually why I got more and more involved into cyber insurance. So back in 2014, I remember reading a report from the UK government, and the essential gist was that cyber insurance can be actually really good and really powerful for cybersecurity. It can basically act as a really strong incentive for companies that actually can nudge companies, or in some regards, push some companies maybe to think more about their cybersecurity. And a lot of my early research in the space really tried to explore, is that the case?
Ransomware seems to come in waves, much like insurance cycles. And the way those two relate or not is quite interesting, I think. So, yeah, it should be great to get a walkthrough of what your view of recent waves of ransomware activity, the current threat landscape, and how you think, when I said about the market cycle, how you think the cyber insurance market is riding those waves.
Yeah. And again, ransomware ties down to people. And there is an underlying aspect there where we can get very predictive about when these types of events are going to happen. And when you see an increase in activity, talking to incident response firms, they always joke that it's whenever somebody in their company is going to go on vacation. That's always their joke, but it may not actually be tied to that. But it is often around holidays. I was just talking to an incident response firm recently, and they were saying there's actually in this new year in 24, there's been a decrease in activity since what we were seeing in December. But a lot of that is tied to the Orthodox holidays. And anytime there's holidays that go on in areas where the bad actors seem to exist, we do see a decrease in activity because they're busy with their personal lives. So these are still people causing these events. With the rise of AI, we may see a little bit of change in that. And that's an area we're watching. Can a bad actor leave their desk and still go have their Christmas dinner with their family and, have their AI machine in the back still perpetuating these ransomware attacks? But we do see it, again, tied to political events as well. And physical wars. There's huge uptick in activity when the Israel-Hamas event happened. We saw it following that. And we also have looked at whether some of these increases in ransomware can be predictive of events. We've looked at that from like a political standpoint. And yeah.
To what you said to do with the Israel-Hamas events since October, how does that tie in then? Who would be the targets in that particular example?
So Iran's very active in this space, and they are supportive of Hamas. So, whether they're going after targeted Israeli companies or infrastructure, which they did, and they were really going after news agencies and television and things like that to try to forward the information that was getting out to the people. So that's one aspect of it. But then you also just see almost malicious activity towards anyone that's supporting Israel. And we did see an uptick in activity specifically from Iran towards the UK and the US following that event. So it's fractured. So you see lots of different motivations behind it, but still tied to a very physical event that's going on.
This is ransomware or different types of attacks?
Yeah, ransomware and then just destructive ransomware. So not ransomware for actual ransom, but ransomware that's just supposed to cause
because
issues.
This can be a misconception, I think, right? Because a lot of ransomware, the majority of it is not actually about stealing data at all. It's usually about denying people access to
it
their
depends on the motivation. When they're targeting big targets and critical infrastructure, they will use ransomware. But you're right. It's not for the money. It's not for the ransom. It's just to cause the discourse. So, the NotPetya event is a very good example of that. It wasn't something where they said, we're in your system, pay us a ransom and we'll get out and give you the key to unlock everything that we've encrypted. They just caused destruction and basically shut everything down. I think there's still a lot of school of thought whether that was intentional and really meant to get out the way that it actually did get out, or whether that was very intentioned to be isolated and just target in Ukraine. I don't know the exact answer to that, but we have seen a lot of those types of activities where it's just destructive ransomware. And then, the data exfiltration part is another thing that is really in emergence right now, and kind of the double extortion aspect of ransomware. That's changed the game in the last couple of years. Where ransomware before, you pay the money or you don't pay the money. You either can restore your information from backups or you get the key and you just go along your, about your day and you've got it all. Now they're stealing information. They're publishing that information online. If you don't pay, they're actually going out and contacting your consumers and telling your consumers or other people in your supply chain or even your shareholders, we have this information, and trying to pressure people to pay that way. So that's a whole other element that's gotten really interesting in the last couple of years and has changed the whole dynamic.
Well, it's funny you should say that, or even the SEC, right? Even the regulator.
Yeah. Yes.
So
they did.
Just one of you want to tell that example because it's a great one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Jason.
So I mean that's a really, really, I say good because it's interesting and because I primarily do research, but it's a really bad thing that has occurred. And essentially, here we have, as Yosha said, it's got a classic incident of ransomware attackers are recognizing that companies are not willing to pay anymore. Companies aren't so worried to the extent, either they have good backups, they know that attackers are not going to provide the decryption keys, they just don't want to engage, they just don't want to fund crime. A lot of companies are saying, no, enough, stop, done. And what attackers are doing is basically trying to find every single way possible to try to nudge or make companies pay out. Some of this, as Yosha was saying, double extortion, triple extortion, taking people that has been impacted, their data, so individuals' data, customers' data, going to them. I remember one case I even saw in the US where attackers impacted this plastic surgery company, and they breached them, and they not only did they go to the company and say pay up, but they took, they exfiltrated data of people's before and after pictures of plastic surgery. And then they went to the people and said, hey, pay up, or we're going to leak these photos online of you in your naked bodies and the whole idea here was to pressure the company or pressure even individuals involved in paying. Now, this example in particular with the SEC in the US is super interesting because now we've seen attackers not only say, we're going to go to your customers, we're going to go to your supply chain, we're going to go to whoever else we can find. They have actually been bold enough to go to the regulator and say, hey, we just breached this company. We told them to pay up. They haven't paid up. And a couple of days have gone. So we think we want to actually file an official complaint about this company not paying up. And they should have told you that we have their data, but they didn't tell you. So therefore, you should do something about it. I mean, that the boldness is just incredible.
And from what I read, I don't think in this example they were successful because the particular...
No, they were not. They were not successful in this.
Those rules, and I forget the detail, aren't in place yet.
I think they hadn't kicked in at that point. I think they kicked in probably a month later.
Yeah, right. I was just going to say, I think they just kicked in January. So it was right before they came into effect. So the SEC said, thank you very much. We'll take that into consideration. Somebody leaked this to the press because it was all over the press as well. Yeah. So I don't know if that was also the bad actors, which I would not have been surprised about.
But I think it's interesting because it's ludicrous, but it's also a nice exemplar. Again, strange use of the word nice, but because in this case, it's the actual bad actor that's playing the stakeholders off against each other. Mm-hmm. Cyber insurance has not always been viewed as a positive incentive for good cyber security, right? And that's within some firms themselves, potentially also by regulators. Well, it's a question for you, Jason. Do you think that perception is misjudged, and how would you challenge it?
So I've seen a lot of this, and this is actually, like I said, this is one of the key ways I actually got into cyber insurance, really trying to understand the interplay between cybersecurity. And there was sort of half of the academic literature that said cyber insurance is a terrible thing for security. Definitely, it doesn't help anything. And there was half of the academic literature that said cyber insurance is brilliant. It's going to make cybersecurity much better. And what I did as part of this research project that I was leading, that was funded by the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, is really to explore this more. And some of the key takeaways that we found were that cyber insurance could actually be really good at supporting and incentivizing better security posture, simply because cyber insurance could, even the discussion, let's say a company wanted to buy insurance, right? So they didn't really focus much on cyber, but they didn't understand security much, but they wanted to buy cyber insurance. Even the initial conversation with a cyber insurer to say is, okay, do you have certain controls? Do you have this in place? What's your risk posture? Even that as initial touch point nudges a company to think more about security. So that's sort of one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is that if a company was supposed to come on board, so let's say an insurer decided to underwrite a company, the insurer could say a few things. They could say, one, we're not going to underwrite you, or we're not going to offer you everything you want unless you implement security control XYZ. Or they could say, we will underwrite you, but you will actually have to give you a discount if you do ABC in terms of the context of cybersecurity. And then even on top of that, some insurers are really good at supporting beforehand. So let's say a company comes on board, the insurer could say, okay, as part of your policy, we will provide you with access to this security awareness training kit, this basically preemptive security control. And in addition to that, of course, one of the big things that we found where cyber insurance can actually be extremely valuable is after the event. I can't tell you the number of companies that when a breach occurs, they don't know what to do. And they sort of scramble. They think, okay, who should we contact? How should we deal with this? Whereas I've spoken to also a number of other companies that have cyber insurance, and what they do literally is a breach has happened. They're not sure what's going on. They call it the cyber insurance company. Cyber insurance company then, digital forensics firms, incident response firms, breach counsel, all of these companies come in and actually support the recovery stage. And I think for me, that's where cyber insurance can be extremely valuable. But there's still, of course, a number of people that think that basically, instead of spending your money on cyber insurance, you should be doing better security. There will be people that think like that. But for what I've seen, all the evidence that we've done, and this is based on interviews with over 100 cybersecurity, cyber insurance, incident response professionals, people from government. And from what we've seen, it can definitely be an amazing thing for cybersecurity. The only caveat that we found was, one, the cyber insurance penetration rates just aren't there yet. Enough companies don't have cyber insurance. So when we look at things on a broad scale, the impact, let's say at a national scale for cyber insurance, the impact of cybersecurity in companies isn't there just because the penetration just isn't as high. And then one thing that we found that was tricky from an insurance perspective is that some companies basically complained and said, when they go to one cyber insurer, the cyber insurer says, I want ISO 27000. They go to another one, the other one says, I want NIST cybersecurity framework. Another one says something else. And I think one thing that companies flagged was just there was a little bit of inconsistency in the market. And there was a little bit of the policy wording and the standards in the policy weren't clear enough to them. So they viewed those as part of some of the key limitations. But I think if we can address those, if we can solve those, I think cyber insurance can be really, really good in the context of cybersecurity.
Yeah, I totally agree. And 2 points that you made and I want to highlight is I want to say it was 2018, 2019, the FBI actually came out and accused the cyber insurance market of perpetuating ransomware in the US. So it was a situation where we all ended up getting together to start to have a dialogue with the FBI because we didn't agree with that assumption. And they came out and said it in the press. As the insurance community, we were very, very discouraged by that because we felt like we had been trying to push these cybersecurity controls and getting pushback. And so, we're like, let's all get aligned and make sure that we're speaking the same way and we understand what we're trying to achieve. And so, it actually caused us to have a better dialogue with law enforcement. And then I think the other point that you made that I really want to highlight is that whole kind of dichotomy of, do I spend the money on the cyber insurance or do I invest the money into cybersecurity? And that's really changed, I would say, in the last couple of years, kind of the thought process about what the enterprise risk management aspect of cyber insurance looks like, and separating that to a certain degree from the discussion around cybersecurity. It doesn't have to be one or the other. We can do both and actually make a company secure. And, you're completely right. Hit the nail on the head with the reason this coverage exists is for that initial response. And there's a whole bunch of other things behind that when you get the liability aspect and the regulatory and all these other things. But it is initially set there as a service to help these people just have that one phone call and the whole team comes in and is all preset, ready to deploy an action when they need it.
I mean, there is some serious misconceptions in the characterization by the FBI in this case. For example, not just cyber insurance, but any insurance, it's obviously in the insurer's interest that there isn't a claim.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
But even getting beyond that, to look at cyber in particular, this is a product line that's developed, this side of the millennium, and it's not an old-fashioned product in the sense that it's just about reimbursing the client.
Yeah, it's all about the service. It's the ecosystem of cyber insurance is what I call it, and it is truly an ecosystem. But, we are still seeing this conversation, and especially in the US with the government, about encouraging people not to pay. And, if we can get people to not pay, the ransomware bad actors will have nothing to go after. But the reality of that is it doesn't quite play out that way. And the reality of that is that these companies can be really, really severely impacted. When I think of especially SME, and you're talking about companies that don't have that level of sophistication, they may not be able to recover, and it may actually ruin their business completely. So there is that fine line. We don't want people to pay. We don't want to perpetuate this problem. We want to find a way to make it so that this isn't a benefit to the bad actors. But at the same time, we want to ensure that companies can continue to operate and these kind of events don't completely bankrupt them.
I think that's actually the critical point in that, and this is another great question that, and I know exactly what you're talking about with the context of the cyber insurance industry almost being blamed for the rising ransomware. And I read loads of articles claiming exactly that. And we actually did some research specifically on this question of the impact that the cyber insurance industry has on ransomware. And what we found was that actually, in terms of to pay or not to pay, insurers are great at providing an additional set of options that a company wouldn't have or wouldn't have access to. I think that was one of the key things that stood out for us in the research, in that if the insurance provider wasn't involved, the company would almost either have to go back, especially if you're thinking SMEs, have to go bankrupt or pay. Those are sort of the two options. One of the really valuable points with insurance is that all of a sudden now an SME, a larger organization, has options that potentially they didn't have before. And I love the fact you actually mentioned SMEs, Yosha, because from what we found, SMEs are the key touch point. They were key, especially because often SMEs can't afford to have incident response firms on retainer. They can't afford to pay their forensics firm. They can't afford to have breach counsel. Many of these organizations, they focus on their core business. Maybe they have a managed security service provider that helps them out, or they have an IT service provider that helps them out. They don't prioritize security. And the reality is that
so insurance can give them the kind of services, the scale then.
Exactly. And not only that, the reality is with insurers typically have all these companies on retainer. So if something happens, the insurer can easily connect this company to a bunch of expertise that they didn't have access. And many SMEs would never have access to because they couldn't afford it. So one of the big things here is this sort of value proposition. The thing that I think will be the most difficult and tricky over the next couple of months, and this is going back to even the question about waves and ransomware in particular, is, I think it was back in October, the US and the UK and I think Australia and a bunch of other companies, as part of the counter ransomware initiative, they all came together and they said, as governments, as government entities, we all sign up to agreeing that we will not, especially from government funds, pay ransoms. We will not support or perpetuate the ransomware ecosystem. The thing that worries me the most, if I can be frank, is that I'm sure attackers, ransomware groups, ransomware gangs, they stood there and they saw that and they thought, oh, okay, well, let's go after critical national infrastructure.
Yeah.
Let's test that resolve. Because if a ransomware group manages to hit some part of critical national infrastructure to the extent where they don't have the backups, people's lives are on the line, that's probably the significant question of, will people pay at that point just to be able to save lives, to ensure people can have clean water? There's a variety of different areas. And I think that's what worries me the most actually in the next couple of months. Yeah. What are attackers going to do in response to...
Once they find those weak links,
exactly.
They'll continue to optimize them. Yeah.
There's a point in here about essentially how resources are allocated within firms, especially for a small or a mid-sized company where they have to make tough decisions about whether you focus on prevention or fighting fires once someone gets inside the walls kind of thing. And it seems to me that cybersecurity is probably more likely to want to keep people out, and risk management might be a little bit more focused on fighting the attackers once they've already broken through, right? Mm-hmm. So it feels like a philosophically different strategy, defensive strategy for dealing with cyber. But I'm just interested in terms of who holds the budget for buying cyber cover, where that's changing at all.
Yeah, it is changing, and it is a different discussion. I would say 10, 15 years ago, when we were talking to a potential insured or prospect insured, you were talking to the risk manager, and it was very focused on the risk management aspect of how is this insurance going to impact the company's bottom line. And if we were asking technical questions about the actual security, you didn't always get the answers. Oh, I don't know. We got to find, let me get the security guy. We got to do this. And the CISOs, the security team, did not want to talk to us. They absolutely did not want to talk to us. They didn't want to have anything to do with insurance. For them, they saw it very much as an attack on their work directly. Like we were saying, you guys aren't good enough at preventing this attack from happening, and that's why we're here for insurance. I think the ransomware has definitely changed that conversation. We've been getting the CISOs to the table. And now most of our meetings and interactions with insurance are CISO led. And we're having a lot of these technical questions, and the risk managers are kind of along as the insurance buyer and support for that. So I wouldn't say that it's shifted from one to the other. What we're seeing right now is a lot more collaboration between those two groups and those organizations. And I also think the change is, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, but the board as well, and the involvement of the board all the way down. So now a lot of times we'll have meetings and we've got the CFO in the meeting, and sometimes you got the COO in the meeting, and you've got the whole organization, every person that has something to do with the overall enterprise risk management and the cybersecurity aspect of that at the table, having that discussion. And that's what needs to happen, because we know when these events happen, all those people need to be at the table anyways. And then one of the things Jason talked about earlier, the insurance community has also been offering a lot of free tools and different packages as part of the insurance as well that companies can take advantage of before they have an event. So, there's lots of different security help things that have been packaged up with the insurance side. And we've seen a very, very, very low take up of those in the past years. And so that's really interesting. We were just talking about that. At Mosaic, we're really starting to build out that part. We've got an affiliation with a company right now called Safe Security. We're just getting deeper and deeper into the security side of things, but we want to round that out completely and start to pull in some of these human elements as well. But we're still seeing a really low take-up rate. And that's something I'm struggling a little bit with in the insurance industry, is how do we get people to realize, they're already paying for their insurance. They might as well take advantage of all these other things that we're throwing in for them as well, because it's only to their advantage. And then that's going to decrease what they actually have to spend on their cybersecurity, because we're augmenting that. So, that's an evolution we're still working through as the insurance industry.
So I think one thing that's super interesting about that I've seen as well is the fact that insurers are becoming much more of, I don't want to say not necessarily a one-stop shop, but they're upskilling to the extent that they can actually engage and support better cybersecurity in a much more sophisticated way than before. And I think this is actually really interesting to see. And over the last couple of years, I've seen more and more partnerships between cyber insurance firms and cybersecurity firms working a bit closer together to ensure, of course, that products or services are available for companies if they need them, all via their cyber insurance policy. I've seen engagement between cyber insurers and cybersecurity firms as it relates to threat intelligence sharing. Because, of course, from an insurance perspective, you always want to have some good idea of what's the state of the market in the context of the threat exposure, what threat intelligence might be useful to help me understand whether I should underwrite this company or that company. So I think there's lots of value in security firms working more closely with cyber insurance firms, especially in the context of what you just mentioned. I think one thing that, and I really feel bad about saying this, but one thing that I think, one good thing, if I can say that ransomware has done, is that it's made companies think much more carefully about cybersecurity and cyber insurance. Because before, yes, cybersecurity was a big thing. Yes, data breaches were a big thing. No, one, the extent of ransoms and how significant the payments are is just crazy. Two, how prevalent the ransomware threat is. So it's constant. Everyone's talking about it. It's everywhere. Everyone's getting hit. And then three, the reality is that because all this is happening, boards need to really think carefully about security. And part of this is thinking about, okay, what does a comprehensive security package, how do I comprehensively secure my organization? And cyber insurance can help that. It can support that. I think one of the key things that is important, though, and I know this is some area where cybersecurity professionals somehow struggle, and I know sometimes this is where there's a little bit of tension, is that sometimes, I'm going back to one of your initial questions actually, is sometimes cybersecurity professionals think, especially those that sort of own the cybersecurity budget, they think cyber insurance is going to have to come up with that budget.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, oh, wait, I have this amount to spend on security controls, and now all of a sudden I need to pay for cyber insurance. And I think that's where the tension sort of comes up. So I think the more that we can actually think a bit more carefully about where does cyber insurance stand, who owns it, who pays for it, what budget it comes out of, the companies that do really well and sort of really think carefully about the overall cyber resilience, if they can prioritize and get that to work better, I think that's going to be extremely useful.
I want to move the conversation on a bit for our last section to more talking about government.
Mm-hmm.
Keeping, obviously, we're never far away from talking about cyber insurance and cybersecurity, but it does strike me that something I read in one of your papers, Jason, that whilst clearly good legislation is essential, well, it's a matter of when rather than if you become a target of one of these ransomware attacks. And particularly with the way geopolitically the world is these days, and so many permissive jurisdictions or outright hostile jurisdictions to the West, it's highly likely that the bad actors are going to be within those jurisdictions. You made this point. It was in some written evidence submission you did to one of the UK parliamentary committees. Yeah. Essentially, I don't want to do down the value of legislation, but it's becoming less of the picture because it's not going to be as effective when the bad actor is in one of those jurisdictions, which places the emphasis much more squarely on cybersecurity, cyber insurance, and government acknowledging that in the way it works with those actors, right?
I think legislation is super important. It's very, very necessary. But the reality with legislation is that legislation always will be, firstly, a couple of years behind the tech. It's just the way how it works. But then, yes, in the context of what you mentioned, a lot of these bad attackers are international. What we have seen in the past, which is great to see, is that some countries sort of put pressure on other countries to act and to basically go after some of the attackers in their jurisdictions, but it's rare. It's rare. So it really puts, as you mentioned, it puts the emphasis on all the other stakeholders to manage and contain the threat. So better preventative actions, better reactive actions, and better response and recovery. Many organizations, many governments now focus very much on cyber resilience. And the whole gist of cyber resilience is preparing for what's going on, being able to respond very quickly, be able to adapt to whatever you see happening. But this requires organizations, whether it be individual organizations, whether it be cyber insurance or cybersecurity firms, supporting those organizations to be able to act quickly and respond to the threat. And that is going to be critical. And that's where a lot of the emphasis actually lies. So like I said, it's great to see more and more companies thinking more clearly about security, more and more companies being nudged towards better security, because the reality is that attackers are in jurisdictions that it's hard to go after, and attackers will continue to basically launch every form, type, change of attack that they can with the hope of being successful.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point about the information sharing. That's been really key, and I think that's the direction things are moving in. So governmentally, having those conversations about what's going on in various jurisdictions and learning from each other, and then being able to connect those dots. And 12 years ago, when we started talking to law enforcement.
Was this the FBI?
Yeah, the FBI, they weren't talking, because this is a global problem. And it's also, when a company gets attacked, it can happen outside the US. So what jurisdiction does the FBI have over if there is a company that has a location in Europe and the attack actually happens in Europe? You know, what information is the FBI getting? And I think Interpol and the FBI are much more aligned now than they were 10 years ago. We actually have liaisons from different representatives from allies that actually work as part of the FBI. So bringing in people that are part of the British actual intelligence and bringing those into the FBI, and they're starting to share a lot more information. And then just companies, and, you know, I've sat at round tables with the Israeli government and their cybersecurity and understanding what they're looking to do within their country and really how they're looking to make an impact, you know, a country that's heavily attacked. I think the other aspect of this, and Jason, I know you've done some work on this, is the government backstop aspect. What does that look like if we ever get there? And we had a conversation.
It's been a never-ending conversation.
Oh yeah,
about
we had a conversation in DC last summer with the UK government and the US government. And having that conversation, the UK government, I feel like, is a lot more advanced, but it's also a smaller country. You know, you're not dealing with the 50-state issue. So there may be an opportunity for the UK government to enact something faster or quicker. I think the whole discussion around war and cyber war, while the insurance industry has finally gotten their handle around that and drawn the lines of where they want to cover cyber war versus where they don't want to cover cyber war, there's been a lot of work on that through Lloyd's, and there is a lot more clarity now. It does leave somewhat of a gap that the government has to be expected to come in and fill. You know, What does this mean when we have a catastrophic war-like event?
It reminds me of reading headlines about large financial institutions essentially trying and failing to get sufficient cyber cover through the insurance market because, frankly, the institution was bigger than
yeah, exactly, than the market. Yeah.
Maybe to move the conversation away from those enormous financial institutions, we've talked about SMEs quite a bit already.
Yeah.
And well, if we're talking about what government could do more of or do better, things like tax breaks for SMEs, if they show good cyber hygiene, is that something that could see more of? And if, well, two-part question, so that's one thing to maybe talk about. And then also, if you ever do get a kind of cyber pool re in the UK, or whatever the US equivalent times 50 states might look like. Because I'm just thinking the politics of it, realistically. Is that something that's much more likely to be geared towards SMEs? It's not great politics.
I think SMEs is where you have to start, because that's the greatest pool. They're the least penetrated by cyber insurance, so they have the least backstop, and they have the biggest risk. And it's also the core of our economies. You know, you're always thinking these big corporations, but the core of our economy is that mom and pop high street shop. And those altogether is really, essential to our economic viability. And they don't have anything right now. And
it's also better politics, though, to start with an SME high street.
Exactly. And talking about things like tax breaks so that they can invest some of that money into cybersecurity would be a really great start. I think the U.S. government does have a framework for SME business that they roll out. So they say, you're an SME business. We've put together a framework of cybersecurity that you should have, whether that's something you're outsourcing through your MSP or that you're doing personally. But I don't know that people are that aware of it, or I don't really understand how much that's actually utilized. You don't see it publicized. You don't see it really being talked about. So they've put time into this, but it's not advertised properly. And I do know some of the Chamber of Commerce and the local chambers of commerce are making some efforts to get this information out to people, but there's a lot more that we could be doing in that space.
Yeah. In the UK, one of the things that has been good to see to some extent is, so in the UK, we have UK Cyber Essentials, which is sort of 5 key security controls that the UK government considers as essential. So if you're an SME, it's sort of really targeted towards these organizations. And what the UK government has said to nudge better cybersecurity practices is to say, if you want a government contract, if you want to work with government in these sort of ways, you have to have cyber essentials, which basically was good because it basically nudged a number of companies towards getting cyber essentials. Now, of course, one of the realities is we need to be always very cautious about what we're nudging companies to do and not getting them to think of it as a checkbox exercise, but getting them to see the value of actually having cybersecurity. Now, that being said, beyond sort of the government nudges in that way, Cyber Essentials take-up hasn't been as incredible as one would hope. It has been getting better, and it's sort of great to see. I think the UK government actually released a report recently on that, and there's a next one due to come out next month, I believe, or in April. But the reality is that the take-up of cybersecurity by SMEs is still quite low. And it's really great to see that. You mentioned it, Yosha, because the reality, and I actually looked at the stat yesterday, I was writing some research exactly on this. And in most international economies, SMEs make up 99.99% of organizations. And when you think about that in the context of these are the organizations that don't have security best practices, or they can't buy cyber insurance because the cost is too high, or they don't see the value of it, I think these are definitely the areas where we need to think a bit more carefully about how do we support them so that we don't have some critical threat, some systematic risk, or we're not generating some systematic risk where one day, literally 50% of SMEs across the UK or the US gets knocked out by some threat, because that will take down the economy.
It does seem like there's a significant risk to do with, how much daylight there is between different government approaches, with divergence in cyber policy, or whether we're already seeing that. And one aspect of that, I think we already alluded to earlier, was in the treatment of ransoms for ransomware. And there are some great parallels with the K&R market for this already in terms of where you can do business, et cetera, et cetera. So interested to get your views on that.
Yeah, and I think that, pulling in that discussion around the K&R market is interesting, because we were just talking about sharing information, and the K&R market is exactly the opposite of that. It's, keeping this stuff very secretive, keeping the fact that you have insurance secretive, not talking about when you have paid a ransom in the K&R space. It is a very, very secretive segment. We don't know if our own companies have K&R insurance because they're not allowed to talk about it. So if we go in that direction, which, we have said in some ways, please don't disclose to bad actors that you have cyber insurance. Please don't disclose how much limit you have. Don't keep your policy documents online in a way that they can access that information, because that will perpetuate bad behavior. But at the same point, how do we talk and share about the trends that come when it comes to payment, and what does work when it comes to paying or not paying, if we're keeping that information really secretive? So I think there's a fine point there where we can go too far in either extreme, and there's some path in the middle somewhere that's actually going to work when it comes to that segment and how we share or don't share information. And especially from a government side, with the various governments working together, it's great that we have these coalitions of government organizations having these conversations, but they're not always pulling in everyone that needs to be a part of it. And I still feel like it's very, very fractured with what the solution actually is and how we work together with our allies to come up with something that's actually going to be impactful.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think the reality is that, and this is actually where ransomware attackers actually are able to benefit quite a lot. And the reality is that different countries have different approaches to things. This is the nature of different countries, right? And in the US, different states have different approaches to things. So the reality is that attackers know this, and attackers know that some countries might be more willing to pay, some countries might be less willing to pay, some countries might have lots of regulations around payment, some countries might have more regulations around what insurers can do and cannot do. And I think all of this is exactly what attackers are exploiting. Sometimes the lack of agreement across countries, like I mentioned with respect to the Counter Ransomware Initiative, that was great to see that countries came together. I think it was 40 or 50 countries came together and they said, as a set of countries, we will not pay ransoms with government funds. That was great to see. What about all the other countries?
I know, that's exactly. Was Canada part of that discussion? Was Germany part of that discussion?
This is the reality, right? So the challenge here, which attackers know and they're exploiting left, right, and center, is the fact that there are different countries, there are different agreements. Different countries will have different approaches to ransomware, to cybersecurity. Some countries will also be attacked more. So, of course, countries that are attacked more will have more skin in the game. They'll be more interested in sort of international and collaborative efforts to do something about it. Some countries might be attacked less, so they might actually, I don't necessarily care less, but they might not actually be as worried about the threat or not as worried about the threat currently. So I think all of these are unfortunate points. That means that attackers are basically just waiting to see what happens and who do they attack. I remember, this is probably going back 5-10 years ago, I was monitoring different scams. And this was sort of, especially scams focusing on different parts of the world. And what I saw was most scams started in the US. By targeting the US. And then as the US started to recognize these scams, they started to put government information, government notifications, awareness campaigns, etc., started to educate people, okay, these are the scams. And then, of course, things got better. So what attackers did, just moved across a bit. Okay, they moved to Europe, started targeting Europe, same scams, just different population. Okay, Europe started to become upskilled, they started to understand, just moved a bit further across to Asia. And I think one thing that worries me the most is that attackers are starting with the US and sort of Europe, especially because they know this is where a lot of the world economy lies. This is where, some countries might be more interested in targeting. And the thing that I think we all need to consider is the fact that some countries just basically have more skin in the game. But really, to tackle ransomware, Yosha said it before, ransomware is an international problem. Mm-hmm. Ransomware is people in states perpetuating attacks against people in organizations in other states. This needs a collaborative effort. It needs sort of more countries to be involved, more governments to be involved, and sort of take it on as a critical issue and decide to do something actively about it.
Thank you for listening to this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast in association with Mosaic Insurance. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guests, Yosha DeLong and Jason Nurse. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin provided the music.